Why is it that we intuitively believe that Neanderthals were primitive? So, g'day, it's Ken Colson here again, Creation Unfolding, and today, actually interviewing Dr. Marcus Ross on a paper that he presented on at the International Conference on Creationism that was held in Ohio just this year, 2023. So Dr. Marcus Ross, he's the former director of the Center for Creation Studies at Liberty University, published in the secular and in creationist literature, avid creationist, doing lots of research, as we'll see today, and also has his own business, Cornerstone. And so actually I'm going to let Dr. Marcus Ross tell you a little bit about that. So Marcus, tell us a little bit about what you do, what you've been doing, Cornerstone.
Sure. Well, thanks, Ken, for having me on. I really appreciate the chance to get on your channel, which, by the way, I love. I watch it when you get things out, and your animations are fun. Content's great. Thank you for providing, such a cool channel for creationists and for those who are curious about creationism, and for bringing such a genial spirit to what is often a really rancorous and contentious debate. So, that's just a real service you do. Thank you.
We got to be focused on that genial spirit, right?
That's right. I mean, God's world is pretty awesome, and hopefully that kind of comes through in the way that we approach it and approach the fellow people out there that are made in God's image. So, which is kind of the topic that we're going to be getting to here today.
Right.
So, just a little bit about me. My background is in vertebrate paleontology. My PhD work I was studying mosasaurs, which are the big swimming marine reptiles. They're technically lizards. So while dinosaurs aren't lizards, mosasaurs were, and they're kind of like a big monitor lizard, like a Komodo dragon, but with flippers instead of arms and legs. And they got anywhere from like 12 to 54 feet in length, and probably about 40 different genera at this point in mosasaurs. So I got to study them for my PhD work, and then as I finished that up, I went over and I worked at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia, for 16 years, from 2005 to 2021. Where I was the fossils and rocks guy there, right? I taught earth science and geology. I taught classes in paleontology and environmental sciences, as well as creation studies. And eventually I became the director of the Center for Creation Studies there at Liberty from 2017 to 2021. And I stepped down in 2021, not because I didn't like teaching and because I didn't want to be at the university, but because this company that my wife and I had started, called Cornerstone Educational Supply, had grown to a point where we kind of had to pick, one pony, and which one are we going to go with? And so decided to step out and start working full time for Cornerstone, which we launched in 2015. Our aim with our company is to provide science supplies to people, to homeschoolers, to Christian schools, to colleges and universities. We have a pretty strong specialization in making custom kits for different curricula. So, for example, we make biology and chemistry and physics kits for, say, master books and their master's class series, or Berean builders and their series of high school and junior high books. So if there's some homeschoolers that are watching this, they know those. They're like, oh yeah, we're the company who produces those kits, sometimes directly for the publishers, and other times, we just pop them up on our site. But we're growing into an all-purpose science supply company. So whether you need a few rocks and fossils for a unit on geology, or whether you need dissection supplies or chemicals, we're growing into that role as being able to provide hopefully really great products to people and teach them a little bit about God's creation as we go.
Great. So just Google Cornerstone. What is it? Cornerstone
Educational Supply, and you can find us at cornerstone-edsupply.com.
Yeah, great. And I will stick a icon up for you viewers so you can have a look. Okay, so great. Well, so today we're going to look at the paper that you presented at the International Conference on Creationism, which was just not that long ago, just about a month ago now. And I've read this paper. It's great. And as you know, I've done a couple of videos sort of on this topic as well. So for those viewers out there, the links will be down there in the description for those. So tell us, first of all, this paper, first of all, it's not just you that's the author. We've got some other authors on the paper as well. So just go ahead and tell us about that.
Sure. Yeah, my co-authors are Todd Wood from Core Academy of Science and Peter Brummel, who's an undergraduate student and was working with Core and with Todd on this. And Todd was a driving force behind this paper. Let me get that out, right up from the get-go. Even though I'm first author on the paper and I presented at ICC, Todd did the majority of the work on this, and I owe him a great debt of gratitude for helping put this paper together. I pitched the idea to him, but then we ran into a little bit of trouble with our company last year, which was unfortunate. I just kind of overspent ourselves, and I went, "Sorry, Todd, I've got to clean some things up here." And praise God, we're in much better shape now. But it's pretty amazing, right? Todd's been thinking and working on human origins issues for the better part of like 12, 13 years right now. So it was astonishing what happened when all of a sudden it's like, okay, Todd, let's give a overview and an analysis of where we are on the human fossil record and what it means for a total view of creation. And, he just had all of these ideas that finally, came out onto paper. And so I worked with that as well and had some things. I'd been working on another project involving human origins for a forthcoming book by Broadman and Holman, one of those multiple views books,
right?
Where we got several different authors. And so I'd been coming at it from one direction, and Todd had been coming at it from like 8 directions over the last 13 years. And so teaming up together to write this paper was just really awesome. And Peter likewise has been doing great work. I've been working with Todd. They presented, original research. They've gone out and studied some of the skeletons and the high quality cast in order to make improvements to the data sets of observations of skeletal material and publish that work. So, it's just a great opportunity to work with a couple of folks who are really trying to do solid work, present it not just within the creation community, but within the broader, scientific community as well.
Yeah, that's actually pretty cool because creationists right now are doing some exceptional research and publishing not just in creationist literature. So a lot of this stuff on paleontology, I mean, not particularly on that, maybe this topic here, but it's getting published in secular journals as well. So, guys are doing that. So, and this is great. This is exactly what we want to see. So, cool. So, I mean, what's the basic gist of the paper? Why is it important for us as creationists?
Well, one of the things that happens, I think, a lot of times when we write about issues in creationism is that we tend to be very topical and sometimes a little bit reactionary, right? There's some big important issue out there, and so we need to address it. But what we sometimes fail to do is kind of step back and say, okay, but how does this whole discipline operate within young Earth creationism? Mm-hmm. And so that was really the thrust of this paper. There's been a huge amount of change and a huge amount of new information that has been coming out from paleoanthropology for the past decade and a half. I mean, it is a renaissance that we are right sitting in the middle of, and there's no sign that it's stopping anytime soon. And so, the last major book to come out within creationism on this issue would probably be Contested Bones by Sanford, Rupin Sanford. And even that now I think was about 2017. And there's been a lot of discoveries and a lot of things that have happened since then. So what we wanted to do with this paper was provide a synthesis of paleoanthropology and then see what we could do to put down some mile markers about when things are happening, what are our options within the biblical record for time frames and all that stuff that's going on. So the title of the paper was Human History from Adam to Abraham, Integrating Paleoanthropology with within a young Earth creation perspective. And that was really the goal here. How do we get a view not only of the record itself, but place it within an understanding of what is pre-flood, flood, post-flood, getting us up to Abram? What do we do about things even like the Tower of Babel, which creationists talk about the Tower of Babel a lot, but not usually in the context of, well, what does that mean in relation to, say, Neanderthals or Homo erectus, and those sorts of things? Where do we place them with that? And so it was a big synthetic paper And in my presentation to the ICC, I couldn't even get through the whole thing. So it was a lot to do. And so
I
we're
didn't
waiting.
actually see the presentation. I'm sad I didn't see it, but obviously, as you know, there was so much going on. There were like maybe 3 different talks at the same time, and this ICC was unlike a lot of. I mean, I guess this one, the last one, they're really starting to have some fantastic stuff. So,
I agree. It was a packed meeting, absolutely. You know, with 2 main tracks and then the abstract tracks, and the abstracts had, you know, those had some fantastic stuff in there.
Yeah.
And then you had your workshops, and you had field trips and evening event. It was, yeah, it was. There were too many fire hoses, right? It's not just drinking out of one. There was like 3 of them going on at the same time. And you're like, well,
yeah, that's right.
Only so much time.
It was full on. And it is important, you know, those Neanderthals, Homo erectus, these fossils. I just did a presentation at church for our youth group, and you know, I asked them, "What do you do with Neanderthals?" You know, before we get going, what do we do with Neanderthals? Well, I mean, scam was the word that sort of came out. It's like, why do we default? I mean, why is it that a lot of I guess young Christian children, teenagers default to sort of, oh, it's a scam? And this is where we really need to be able to provide answers, right? We need to say, hey, this is what Neanderthal is, or this is what Homo erectus is, and this is what I think this paper does. So this is great. Okay, a couple of things. I mean, first of all, you start off the paper with what does it mean to be human? So, and this is really important, right? Because when we look at, and of course, as this, you know, as our interview is going here, I'm going to be popping up pictures so people can see different things. But as we look at some of these different fossils, you know, these early humans, they do look, especially in the cranial area, they do look very different than we do today. So, what does it mean to be human, and how do we, what do we do with the physical aspects?
Yeah, so our paper is kind of divided into 3 big units, and the first of these 3 units was dealing with the image of God, you know, and what is it to be human? And that is a topic which, if you jump into it theologically, I mean, my goodness, there's so much that's been written about the image of God from lots of different directions. We know that it's first used in Genesis 1:26 and 1:27, where God says, "Let us make man in our own image and after our likeness." And so we go through a little bit first biblically and start working through what are the terms that are used, how are these understood by theologians, so that we get an idea and a sense of what the image of God is. And we find ourselves in very broad agreement with theologian Jack Collins. You'll see him as C. John Collins on his books and the like, because there's been a debate within theology of, historically, a lot of people looked at the image of God and said, okay, that means that we have certain physical features, we have certain mental capabilities, a lot of emphasis on like our spiritual nature, our intellect, etc. But really, in the last 15 to 20 years, there's been a bit of a shift amongst especially evangelicals and others looking at it and saying, yeah, but the word here, image of God, is the Hebrew word tselem. And tselem is used elsewhere in Scripture for the word idol, right? It's an image. Don't make for yourself a graven tselem, and we are the tselem of God. So that's rather interesting, because then you start to ask, well, okay, what is the role and the function of an idol? Well, obviously, it's a location or a localization of the deity for worship in some way. But for God to say that He made us in His image, a lot of theologians are looking at this and saying, well, it's actually a positional sort of thing for us, that we are the physical representation of God on earth. Now, where Collins makes a great observation here is that, well, in order to be that image, in order to represent God in the world as His image, after His likeness, we also do have to have these various types of capabilities. We have to have certain types of intellect. We have to be able to commune with God, etc. So it's not a one or the other. It's kind of a both and on this one. But in order to represent God, we have to have certain traits of various types. And obviously, God is free to have created us in any way that He wants to, but He did make us in a particular way. So we're going to be looking at certain things in order to see if we can see what that image is. And the way that Todd, Peter, and I approach this is by saying, well, you don't fossilize the image of God directly. That doesn't happen.
Yeah.
But what are the sorts of things that we as humans do that we leave behind that could also be represented or preserved in the hominin fossil record, for example, that would be indicators of individuals that have the image of God? So we looked for cultural artifacts. We looked for various sorts of things that people did or made or what have you that would indicate that they have an extraordinarily high level of cognition, much higher than, say, chimpanzees and whatnot, which are very intelligent animals. But nonetheless, there's reasons why we recognize ourselves as being very different from them.
Right.
And so we went through and looked at 6 different cultural evidences. The controlled use of fire. That's a huge thing for being able to do a lot of other things. It's something that only humans ever seem to have been able to master, along with some other things in the fossil records. The question is, are they human or are they not, if they've got controlled use of fire? The making of advanced tools, not just a tool of opportunity, not just a stick that you can use to poke a termite nest, but actually having forethought and planning, knowing that you have a shape or an object that you want to make, and so you build towards that. So controlled use of fire, manufacture of tools, crafting of unnecessary objects that might represent creativity or some type of preference. We even see that sometimes in the tools, right? You have some tools that are shaped in a certain way in order to do their job, and others that are shaped more beautifully, so to speak, right? You can have 2 hand axes. William Lane Craig points this out in his book. He draws a line. He doesn't want to have, say, Homo erectus as human. So he looks at a Homo erectus hand axe and says, nah, that's not good enough. Well, look at this one from Homo heidelbergensis, and it's beautiful and it's almond shaped and it's been chiseled all fine. I'm like, I look at it and think, yeah, somebody had a lot of time to make a hand axe and somebody kind of didn't care, but they both do the same job, but one's beautiful.
Right.
And I think I can agree with Craig that something like artistic beauty should count towards humanity, but I think he also discounts the fact that in the end, one's a Harbor Freight tool and one's DeWalt, so okay, they both do the same thing. So we looked at that. We looked for indicators that individuals might have cared for their wounded or their elderly, not just staying by the body, but prolonged care that would have been necessary in order to keep somebody alive, to heal from, say, a massive trauma. Intentional burial of the dead, something that only, as far as we know, only humans do. And so are there any indicators in the past of that? Or the last one had to deal with kind of dispersion and exploration. Do we have evidence of species and individuals that have gone far beyond the bounds of normal walking and traversing and migration, but have purposefully crossed large stretches of, say, oceanic water to get to some place, especially if it was never connected to the mainland? Can we distinguish between those who could have, hiked across a strait versus those who had to cross on boat? We looked at those who might have been investigating and doing things deep within caves far beyond the sunlit region, where you would have to use fire, for example, and other sorts of things. So those were the 6 that we kind of set up as these are some good evidences of advanced cognition, cultural representations that we can find in the fossil record. There's all sorts of things that, maybe we might use that we can't find, but these are ones that we just might be able to find or rule out, or rule in and possibly rule out with some. Right. So that was really the first half, the first third of the paper was looking at what is the image of God, how do we understand it, and then what are some cultural artifacts and evidences of it.
Yeah, and then you basically, after having that criteria, you found is it something like you called it a Lubinal core group that most creationists believe are humans had some of these different criteria.
That's right. We coined a term in honor of creationist anthropologist Marvin Lubinal of what we call the Lubinal core humans. And that would be Homo sapiens, ourselves, Neanderthals, and Homo erectus, which Lubinal had made very strong arguments in his books, Bones of Contention. He had a first and a second edition. He made a very strong argument that those 3 are, in fact, human. And he also very strongly argued that, say, Australopithecines like Lucy and Paranthropus and others should be excluded from humans. So he had a variety of different physical traits and criteria. A lot of it was skeletal stuff, but he also dealt with some of these cultural artifacts that we labeled out over here. What was at least known at the time when he was writing in the 90s and the early 2000s. And again, there's been a lot that has been discovered since then. But yeah, creationists pretty much across the board are in agreement that these three taxa are in fact human. And we had a big table that we had in the paper. And I think as far as those three, there was only one source that we had surveyed, and I believe it was Quazzo. Yeah, Quazzo 1998. He thought that Homo erectus was ape. And among the major works that we studied and surveyed for this, he would be the only outlier on that. Everybody else thought that Neanderthals and Homo erectus, including Homo ergaster, the form found in Africa, for example, qualify as human. And so then we said, okay, if we've got these, on what basis do we have these? And that's where those cultural artifacts also came into play. Right. We took a look at all these different species in the fossil record and said, do you show evidence of any of them? Now, it's important also to remember as we go through this that simply possessing one cultural artifact, we did not consider, a lock then that organism was in fact human. We much prefer to see a broad suite of these criteria that are checked, or at least have good possibility of being there for the species, as kind of a concert of evidence approach. That's going to give us a much more robust understanding of who is versus who is not humans. So, for example, with the Neanderthals, they check all of the boxes, and they check all of the boxes with like big, solid check marks. They definitely used fire. They made very complicated tools, including bone tools, which are harder to make than stone tools. They sewed clothing and made jewelry for themselves, or various types of ornamentations. We have eagle talons that have little bore holes through it. Looks like they were on a necklace, for example. Shells that were found in one tribe that actually came from a couple hundred miles away in the Mediterranean. So it looks like they had a lot of these different sorts of evidences. We know that they cared for their sick and their injured, at least on occasion. They buried their dead purposefully, and they interbred with ourselves. We know now from genetic evidence that Neanderthals and we were able to hybridize. And of course, thinking more broadly about creation issues of like, what is a kind? Well, the ability to hybridize between two organisms was almost always considered, strong positive evidence that two organisms are part of the same kind. So to answer the question for those kids that you were talking to, what is Neanderthal? A cousin, right. not fake, not fraud, not a scam,
not an ape-man.
Right. Definitely not an ape-man. Just, Uncle Thag, right. Or whatever it happened to be called. So Neanderthals showed a lot of these cultural evidences, whereas some other ones, say Homo habilis and Homo rudolfensis, which currently seem to cluster with humans in the baraminological analyses. So on the skeletal evidence, they tend to be in with humans, but they only showed evidence of tools, for example. We don't have any of the other cultural evidences. So their inclusion in humanity is possible. It might even be plausible, but I might not even bring it to plausible. It's just possible right now. So those would be two examples of kind of the extremes, where you've got lots of really good evidence, and then you've got not a whole lot to go with there.
Yeah, I guess Homo erectus is probably a pretty important one, right? Because it's kind of like, when you think of a sort of a first human, I guess Homo erectus is sort of it. So what about Homo erectus? What did you find with that particular fossil?
Well, one of the things that's rather interesting about erectus, and again, I'll use erectus in what you and I talk about in paleontology, sensu lato, in the broad sense. This would include the ones from Democratic Republic of Georgia, the Diminishing Homo erectines, and the African ones, the stuff out in Asia, the classic Homo erectus. We did find that when it came to Homo erectus, they showed pretty strong evidence for certainly the manufacture of tools, and quite possibly also for long distance exploration, not only in the fact that Homo erectines are found across the entire old world, not so much from Europe proper, aside from Diminishing, but nonetheless from Africa all the way over to Southeast Asia. They're over a wide area. But we did note that there was a Russian expedition to the island of Socotra in the early 2000s, 2008 or so. A team of Russian anthropologists went out there. Now, for geography, Socotra is off the Horn of Africa by a good 80, well, no, more than that. It's probably 200 miles off the coast. A couple little islands before that. It's technically now owned by Yemen, and so you can either try to get to it through Yemen or Sudan,
right?
Somalia. So like no thanks, not going.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the Russians went there via Yemen in 2008, and they found this massive number of Oldowan tools. Now, the Oldowan tool technology are chips and flakes that are not very well processed. Kind of, you take a central core of a stone like flint, and you whack at it with another stone, and pieces break off, and they're very sharp because flint is a lot like quartz and obsidian in the way that it breaks, and it makes these really sharp edges. So you break off a little chip like that. Now you got yourself a little scraper, a little knife, just a little tool. And they found boatloads of these things made of a variety of different types of rocks. Sometimes it's basalt, but flint is an important one. And some of them are quite large, some of them are pretty small. And their dating of this indicated that we're looking at old stuff as far as humans go. So they think that this was Homo erectus, and some of this was stuff that was excavated out of strata that's several meters deep, of infill. So it's not stuff that's just lying around that was made by somebody very recently. This stuff was buried down, and even at glacial maximum during the peak ice age, this island was still 60 kilometers away from the mainland. You couldn't even see it, which means not only do you have to get yourself over there, you've got to find that it even exists. So you've got to get in a boat. And if you're getting in a boat, you don't just kind of accidentally get washed out over there. You've got to have a boat, and you've got to be able to communicate with people. So this indicates that we're dealing with people with language and speech, because you have to be able to say, paddle on the right side, faster, watch the current, wave coming. You got to do this stuff. So the good evidence then that Homo erectus was exploring areas and going in a variety of places. We also have some possible examples of fire use. It's a little more tenuous, but nonetheless, probably good evidence for fire use with them, and also potentially some creative work. There's a shell and a couple of shells actually in the original type locality of Homo erectus out in Java that show these interesting scratch marks that are parallel to one another, very carefully and strongly dug down into. This wasn't some sort of accidental claw from a cat or something like that. And the cool thing is the authors noted that these freshwater mussels are black in color, but the shell material underneath is white. So by scraping through it, they actually had this very stark white on black contrast. So, so what were they doing? I don't know. Like doodling, scratching, wasting some time, doing whatever. But it was very, very purposeful. You got these parallel lines and secondary parallel lines going with them. So somebody was doing something with those shells at the type location for Homo erectus. So that's 4 right there. We're not really sure about care for sick or injured. There's a couple potentials, but they're not really, really suggestive. So, and then disposal of the dead and interbreeding with Homo sapiens, we have no evidence for them one way or the other. I wouldn't be surprised if there was, a whole load of Homo erectus genes within us for reasons that maybe we'll get to, later on.
Yeah, cool, excellent. So now I think basically creationists, for the most part, were in agreement on these Lubinal core humans. What about where we find them? So a question that I often get is are there humans in the in flood rocks, and why don't we find them in flood rocks? What about these fossils? Are these flood representatives that died in the flood or not? And what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that these are all post-flood deposits, and within young Earth creationism, we have some interesting debates about how much of the geological record is made by the flood. Is it this much, or is it that much? And the thing is that despite the fact that we're arguing about where to put the end of the flood and the beginning of the flood, and just to put a shout out to your presentation at ICC as well.
Yeah.
We've got these debates about what counts as flood rocks. Pretty much no matter where anybody draws the line, these particular fossils are after the flood.
Okay.
They're found in Pleistocene deposits. On the conventional timescale, we're looking about the last 2 million years, give or take, on that. But for us, at least on a relative sense, agreeing that we can call these sediments Pleistocene sediments.
Mm-hmm.
And for context, it's during the Pleistocene that the Ice Age builds up over time. So we can think of these as more or less kind of like Ice Age fossils. Not exactly, but pretty close. They're at least kind of coincident with parts of the Ice Age.
Yeah.
And not to say even that ice was everywhere. Like ice was just up around the northern regions and the southern regions. But if you were in Africa as a Homo erectus during the peak of the Ice Age, you wouldn't know that it was an Ice Age. Africa's still hot. It's still tropical. None of that has changed. So yeah, I think that these are post-flood. Where are the human fossils? As far as the flood stuff goes, I haven't seen anything convincing to me that we have evidence of humans in the flood rocks, and that's a strong challenge to young Earth creationists. I don't think that we have a great answer to that. But as I recently heard Todd and Paul talk on their channel over at Let's Talk Creation, it's not just that there are missing humans in the flood rocks. There could be missing other stuff as well. There could be other like modern mammals that we're accustomed to seeing are not found in at least what I think are part of the flood rocks. Other young Earth creationists move the flood up high enough that they can incorporate some of the other things. So yeah, humans are missing, and that's a tough problem for us at the moment.
Right. Good. It's one that we need to get answered. So with these post-flood humans then, and again, one of the reasons I think why we believe they're post-flood is because they're found in caves that are cut into what most creationists believe are flood rocks. And there are things like hearths and stone tools and other things in there that wouldn't have been there if they actually were generated in the flood. So I think it's just good to establish that, because just so that people can understand these are post-flood humans, which then, brings us to another question. Well, if they are post-flood humans, then how do we understand them in terms of Noah and his family?
Yeah, so that brings us to the third part of our paper was, okay, now that we got a sense of kind of who is and who isn't human. And there are edge cases on that too, right? There's debate amongst creationists as to the status of something like Homo naledi, or Homo floresiensis, or things like that. But nonetheless, we at least kind of recognized as we went through this paper that we've got not only the Lubinal core humans, but also some of the mid-Pleistocene Homo groups like Homo heidelbergensis. A lot of young Earth creationists think that the hobbits, Homo floresiensis, are humans. So we seem to have a pretty good consensus. Overall, it was actually quite surprising to see how many places we were, the different authors were in, relative agreement with one another. And then there's a few things that we kind of, are unsure about, which I think is actually kind of interesting, right, and helpful for your readers and your viewers. And I know that they know this because you talk about places where we know and where we don't know, and where there's so much more to learn, and that's exciting. Right. The fact that it's not all known. And we run into this in science all the time. People just kind of think, oh, we go into science class, we're just going to learn about what everybody already knows. There's nothing left to learn. Mm-hmm. Oh, my goodness. The more that you learn, it's like, yeah, but I don't know anything about this and this and this. And there's like this whole section over here where nobody knows anything about.
The whole gets deeper.
It does. It does. So looking at this then from a creation model, and you mentioned, putting these in a post-flood context. This was a section that Todd had worked on quite a bit for looking at the caves, looking at stone tools and their provenance, where they come from. And yeah, I think we can make a very strong case that the sediments that these fossils are found in are in fact post-flood. So if they're post-flood, are they, say, before or after Babel? Right. So we know that Babel is an event that happened sometime after the flood, and very likely before Abraham, because not that the story is exactly chronological, because Genesis chapter 10 might be a little bit more topical. And then 11 kind of comes back somewhere in that and tells us about the Tower of Babel story. So what about these people that we seem to think are in fact human? So we actually give two possibilities and lean towards one in the paper about how to understand them with respect to Babel. The first option is the traditional perspective that all humanity was concentrated at the tower, and that there were no people that had migrated away from that at that point.
Right.
So we might be looking at a few hundred years or maybe more, depending on how you take the genealogies in Genesis 11, whether you consider them very strict and tight, or whether you allow them to be a little bit more loose. But nonetheless, are we looking at humans that stay isolated and localized until Babel and are then dispersed across the whole world? That certainly makes the most sense of the biblical text, because we have a kind of an overall perspective in Genesis 1 through 11 that is universal. We have the creation of the entire world, the creation of the first people, the introduction of sin to the world when before there was none, the destruction of the entire world by a global flood, and then the dispersal of all people and the development of all, in this case, ancient languages from that dispersal. So this perspective fits very, very nicely within kind of a unified view of Genesis 1 through 11. Mm-hmm. And that would be the view that overall we favor then in the paper. We think that that's probably got the best argument overall going for it. Mm-hmm. However, there's another option out there as well, and that is that perhaps the Tower of Babel is actually a localized event that is dealing with people living in a particular area of Mesopotamia, and in particular, the Hamites, because we follow the genealogies a little bit, and this seems to be the people who migrate and live out in the area of what is now, or what it was then, Babylon. And so is this just a dispersal of them and their culture? One place where your viewers might have seen that or can see that is in the discussion in the movie Is Genesis History by archaeologist and linguist Doug Petrovich. So he favors a perspective that what we have is a shattering of a particular culture in Mesopotamia that then spreads out into the rest of the world, and the world is already populated. Both of these views have their advantages and their disadvantages. The former view, again, the advantages are big time in terms of scripture. It also gives us an idea of thinking about why it is that maybe the first people that we find seem to be so primitive. Right? They're using stone tools and whatnot, but we've got back in Genesis 4 in the genealogy of Cain that Cain's descendants started making metal implements. And I would think that after the flood, people would start finding where metals are again in the world and start, making that stuff. So why is it that the earliest humans that we have, the earliest people, are using stone tools? Well, one possibility is that when Babel happens, the civilization is shattered and fragmented so much that everybody is out for survival only for the first several centuries or millennia. And the only thing that they care to do is get away, as far away as possible. And as a result, they also lost their interconnections to the other people who had particular skills. And so everybody is basically cast away, right? It's survivor. And so you just got to make do, and then you've got to figure out where you're living, what you're doing, do you have any resources, and rebuild society all over again. So this might be a way in which we could understand why the anthropological record looks the way that it does. The alternate hypothesis, however, would allow us to have many of these early humans, like Homo erectus and heidelbergensis, and eventually Neanderthals, etc., migrate out into the world ahead of time. Babel retains its kind of early Bronze Age and late Paleolithic perspective, because it really kind of looks like this is an early Bronze Age to late Paleolithic kind of perspective. They're building a ziggurat, and it's in Mesopotamia. This is a style of architecture that is known to us in that area and in that place. And if people dispersed earlier, out into the world. And Babel represents a dispersal that happens just to the people who are living in that area, who are refusing to go out into the world in some way. Then we could retain that kind of archaeological perspective, and also explain how we have various hominids around the world before we have the cultural dominance that starts up and the civilizations that begin. So, those are two possibilities. And again, we lean towards the former, but we want to have an open hand to make sure that if biblical scholarship comes in and says, actually, based on what we see here and in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, for example, this story is actually about what's going on in one area, that we have the flexibility to say, okay, now we know, and we can go back and look at our models.
Right, basically. So, I mean, in the scriptural account, it says that the people journeyed. So, I guess they got off the ark, and maybe they stayed there for a while. I don't know, 50 years, whatever. And so you have some kind of reproduction going on, families growing, a group of people. Then they decide at some point to go east. It says to the plains of Shinar, where they built Babel. So in this second view, then I guess maybe along the way, people decided, hey, we're chuffing off. We're going this direction. We're going this direction, and the major group would end up building Babel, but these other sort of splinter groups decided that they're chuffing off, and they would be the ones that sort of would be the Neanderthals, Homo erectus. That's kind of the second idea, that.
Yeah, and actually that also that our own physical form, Homo sapiens, may in fact not be, first off, the earliest morph. We're not, and might not even be. Well, let me put it this way. In young Earth creationism, there's a long tradition and history of looking at things like Homo erectus and Neanderthals as, in some way, deviant forms of Homo sapiens. And your video talked about this a couple of episodes back. And I think part of that is rooted in a cultural perspective that, we've got to be the ones that are human. It's got to be us, because after all, look at the world, it's filled with us. Right. There's not many of the Neanderthals, there's not many of the Erectines. And so they can just be these kind of spin-offs that look the way they do because of congenital deformities and, things like that. They're inbred populations and the like. And, over the past several years, I've grown much less enamored with that view, to the point where I think that it really isn't correct at all. I can much more easily envision going from a Homo erectine morphology to us than I can going from us to Homo erectine morphology multiple times in multiple parts of the world, consistently enough that we can say, yeah, this is basically the way that Homo erectines look like, right? Based on cranial capacity, brow ridge size, these other sorts of features, and go, yeah, I don't think that we'd keep spalling off these variants, and I don't think that congenital deformities bring about these kind of consistent morphologies. And you're not going to get them in healthy or in populations over time, right? You got a population that is racked with congenital deformities. That population is doomed. So I don't think that we can chalk up these physical variants to those types of things that creationists have traditionally understood them as. And when you then start thinking about the record stratigraphically and who shows up first and who shows up second, Homo erectus is the first globally, or at least old world wide distributed group of organisms. And they're found early on in places very close to what could be the Ark landing site, within travel distance from some place that might have been Babel. The Diminishing site is one that we kind of end the paper on, kind of saying, hey, here's an example of a locality that has Homo erectines with a broad range of physical features. Some of the erectines actually look a little bit more like Neanderthals. Others look like classic erectines, and one looks like really bizarre and weird, rather apish, and yet it's found with the other four. There's just like 6 skulls, 5 good ones that are known from this area, and it's right in the middle of it all. And you're like, well, what do you do with this? And even the secular anthropologists have been strongly divided. Is this thing a separate species that just happens to be in with these humans? these Homo erectines, or is it actually one of them? And if it is one of them, then then Homo erectus's range of physical variation is really broad. It encompasses almost everybody, from Neanderthals all the way down, and that leaves just us as the one thing kind of a little bit outside the range of just these 5 skulls,
right,
down in Georgia.
And sorry, go on.
Go right ahead.
I was just going to say, and that's that's interesting from a creationist perspective, because thinking from a you have a flood, you have a basically post-apocalyptic world, and you have individuals really going off into this basically this new world, trying to survive. You are going to, I would suggest, you're going to see a rapid change in morphology, both for humans and for animals, as they begin to develop new niches, find new habits, eat new foods. All of these things I would think change their morphology somewhat, and so we would expect to see variant morphologies of different kinds of critters, including humans, right after the flood. I mean, do you think that's a fair assumption?
I think you make a very good point on that. Yeah, that when we take a look at Diminishing, we see this big range of physical variation. It's a lot of what creationists have expected out of the animal realm, that early forms are going to be highly diverse and diversifying rapidly. We might talk about the horses as a classic example, both for evolution and for creationists. We all like the horse series. And, you start off with fairly small horses that look rather different from anything alive today. But in short order, you've got 3-toed horses that are browsers. You've got 3-toed horses that are grazers. You've got different heights and sizes. You've got, variations to them. And as creationists, we look at that and say, oh, wow, diversification within a kind. And we haven't always taken that lesson and said, well, what about us? Does that apply to the humans as well? And could that be one of the reasons why we have these different variations of humans in the record? The Lubinal core, I think, is explained fairly well by thinking about early diversification of humans, and that means that we need to start thinking about ourselves as being differently looking than Noah and his family, not differently abled, not different in our capacities as being made in God's image and have the ability to carry out our duties as God's image bearers, but nonetheless still looking different, right? That Noah would have looked at you and I and gone like, what's with your head? Right?
Yeah.
And we're like, I don't know, where'd your forehead go? It's like, I never had one, right? And go, okay. But, we all kind of think, that we know what the past is like because we consider it in the present. We think of the Sistine Chapel, and who's Adam? Oh yeah, I know what he looks like. He's a white guy,
right?
And so's God. Big white guy.
Yeah,
he's got a beard, right? You ever see it? And you kind of go, yeah, well that's importing a lot of Renaissance ideas of culture into the deep past, and we just kind of carry along that with us, and it's understandable, but understandable can also be quite wrong. Right. About that. And so I think that with the evidence that we have for something like Homo erectus humanity, with their ability to make tools, their very likely controlled use of fire, their exploration, which would have required good language skills and communication and all those sorts of things that we have, I think that was probably something more like what Noah and his family looked like. And as they journeyed out, either after the flood or after Babel, whichever of those models is correct, we start to see the variations start to pop up in different areas. And eventually we have to come up with an explanation as to why Homo sapiens becomes the dominant morph. And right. We're nowhere near getting an answer to that within young Earth creationism right now. Right. But the Homo sapiens morphology first shows up, at least in the rock record, in Africa about 300,000 years ago on the conventional timescale. So Erectus shows up about 2 million, give or take, and we show up about 300,000 on the conventional timescale. That's a pretty good chunk of time, 1.5 million years. For young Earth creationists, we might be dealing with, centuries instead. But why is it that our physical form ends up overtaking. And that is an area where we got to start working next. Right? We started putting together our broad understanding and our kind of mile markers along the way on biblical history. Where do we fit into all of this? Right. Now we have to start getting more granular and getting more detailed. And yet at the same time, as I was talking with Matt McLean, who you've had on the program a couple of times, we also have to preserve the biblical lineages. Right, we've got Shem and Ham and Japheth, and where their lineages go and who they become. But interestingly enough, right, that's genealogical, that's not genetic, and there's a difference between the two of those. And as much as I disagree with, say, the genealogical Adam and Eve hypothesis promoted by Josh Swamidass, he makes a very good point about the distinction between genealogy and genetics and our scientific tendencies to think only in terms of genetics rather in terms of genealogy. So we'll need to bring that to bear as well as we start to try to address these questions about where do the individual species fit in, but also remembering that, okay, we also have bloodlines, if you will. We have families that we're trying to track through biblical history. Yeah, cool. Excellent. Well, look, I think we covered the gamut there. Is there anything else that you want to add to that? Aside from, again, my thanks to Todd and Peter for their great work with me on this project. It was a real honor to work with them and to produce something that we hope will be a standard for as long as it's relevant. And with the pace of anthropology moving at what it is right now, which is amazing. I mean, between Lubinal's first and second edition, there was more than a decade, and very little had actually changed. There were a few more fossil finds, but not much. But then from 2004 to now has just been an absolute blitzkrieg of information, and more is coming out. And Peter and his channel, Paleologos, I mean, he keeps close tabs on all this and does absolutely great videos describing this stuff. So in really accessible terms. So, your readers, your viewers should definitely check him out if they're looking for more on each of these individual fossils. Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, I think we'll wrap it up there. So Dr. Marcus Ross, just thank you so much for coming on. And I'm sure that we'll have you on again soon. We were talking, got some things in the works that we can do. So I'm sure that we'll do that again. So that's all from me here. Ken Colson here at Creation Unfolding. Don't forget, please, if you thought that this video was at all interesting, then go ahead and hit the like button, subscribe, ring the bell for easier access as well. And if you feel like you want to give, then there's a link in the description, so that'd be appreciated as well. There is a website, www.creationunfolding.com. There's more resources there. And we will see you next time. Thanks and goodbye.